The story of the American Revolution begins long before the first shot was fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775. To understand the slow march toward independence, we must travel back to the 17th and early 18th centuries, when 13 small colonies took root along the eastern coast of North America. These colonies, scattered from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south, were bound to the British Crown, but lived in very different ways, shaped by geography, religion, and commerce. Life in these colonies was not uniform. In New England, communities developed around Puritan religious ideals and small-scale farming. Towns were close-knit, church-centered, and education was valued. Further south, in Virginia and the Carolinas, large plantations dominated the landscape, worked by enslaved Africans whose labor sustained tobacco, rice, and indigo production. In between, the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, thrived on trade, fertile land, and diversity of people. For decades, Britain's approach to these colonies was one of salutary neglect. As long as trade flowed and taxes were loosely honored, London allowed the colonists a wide degree of self-rule. Local assemblies passed laws, governors acted with relative independence, and colonists came to believe that, although subjects of the king, they enjoyed freedoms not seen in England itself. This belief, subtle at first, would later feed into the revolutionary spirit. The turning point began after the French and Indian War, known globally as the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. Britain emerged victorious, but the war was costly. The British treasury ran deep into debt, and leaders in London turned to the American colonies as a source of revenue. The logic was simple. Since Britain had spent heavily to defend the colonies should help pay the price. Thus began a long chain of parliamentary acts that stirred resentment in America. The Sugar Act of 1764 imposed duties on molasses and other imports. The following year, the Stamp Act of 1765 required official stamps on printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. To colonists, these were not just taxes, they were symbols of Parliament's intrusion into their local affairs, levied without their consent. The cry that echoed across the colonies was, "No taxation without representation." Colonists argued that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them, not a distant parliament in which they had no voice. Petitions were written, protests organized, and boycotts of British goods began to spread. In Boston, groups such as the Sons of Liberty emerged, using both persuasion and intimidation to resist enforcement. By 1766, under pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but the victory was short-lived. The Declaratory Act passed in its place, boldly asserting that Parliament had full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear: Britain would not relinquish control. Tensions deepened with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, boycotts erupted, and colonial resistance grew bolder. In Boston, British troops were stationed to maintain order, a visible sign that the empire was tightening its grip. The uneasy coexistence of soldiers and citizens led to conflict. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd confronted British troops outside the Custom House in Boston. Snowballs and insults were thrown, confusion spread, and soldiers opened fire. 5 colonists were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though a relatively small incident, colonial leaders like Samuel Adams seized upon it as proof of Britain's tyranny. For a brief period, after 1770, tensions seemed to cool, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. When Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, allowing the British East India Company to sell tea at reduced prices, but still subject to tax, many colonists saw it as a trick to make them accept Parliament's right to tax. In December of that year, protesters, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped over 300 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party shocked Britain and electrified the colonies. London responded with fury. The coercive acts of 1774, called the Intolerable Acts by colonists, closed Boston Harbor until damages were paid, curtailed town meetings, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than America. Massachusetts was placed under military rule. To many colonists, this was no longer a debate about taxes, but a direct assault on their liberties. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They were not yet ready to declare independence, but they did agree on a united response. They endorsed a boycott of British goods and affirmed the colonies' rights to self-governance. More importantly, they built connections that would sustain them through the struggles ahead. Still, Britain refused to compromise. By early 1775, tensions reached a breaking point. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, received orders to seize colonial military supplies stored in Concord, Massachusetts. On the night of April 18th, Patriot riders, including Paul Revere, spread the alarm: the British are coming. At dawn On April 19th, British troops met colonial militia on the Green at Lexington. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first, but the skirmish left 8 colonists dead. The Redcoats marched on to Concord, where they were met with stiff resistance. By day's end, British forces were retreating back to Boston under constant fire from militiamen. The American Revolution had begun. Part 1 closes here, with the first battles marking the transition from protest to open war. The colonies, once loyal subjects of the Crown, now faced the greatest empire in the world. Ahead lay years of struggle, sacrifice, and the uncertain pursuit of independence. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the beginning of open conflict, but they were not yet a full revolution. At this early stage, many colonists still considered themselves loyal to the British Crown. They hoped for reconciliation, believing that Parliament could be persuaded to recognize colonial rights while still maintaining allegiance to King George III. But the events that unfolded over the next year would slowly push the colonies from resistance to independence. After the fighting in Massachusetts, militia from across New England surrounded Boston, trapping British forces inside the city. This was the start of the Siege of Boston. Farmers, tradesmen, and volunteers, ordinary men with limited training, camped outside the city, determined to contain the British army. Supplies were scarce, organization was weak, but the determination of the colonists was clear. In May 1775, delegates once again gathered in Philadelphia, this time for the Second Continental Congress. Unlike the previous year, the situation was now urgent. Blood had been spilled. Delegates debated whether to seek reconciliation or to prepare for war. Voices such as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania still urged caution, but others like John Adams of Massachusetts argued that armed resistance was the only path left. One of the Congress's most important decisions was to create a Continental Army. To lead this new force, they chose George Washington, a tall Virginian with experience from the French and Indian War. Washington accepted, knowing the task ahead was monumental. He left Philadelphia in June and took command of the troops outside Boston. His presence gave the colonial cause a symbol of unity, binding the southern colonies to the northern struggle. Even as Congress organized for war, it made a final attempt at peace. In July 1775, they sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George, declaring loyalty to the Crown and asking for an end to hostilities. The king refused to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. This rejection hardened colonial attitudes and closed the door to compromise. Meanwhile, on June 17, 1775, one of the first major battles took place at Bunker Hill, just outside Boston. Colonial forces fortified positions on Breed's Hill. When British troops advanced, wave after wave, the colonists held firm until their ammunition ran low. Though technically a British victory, with heavy colonial losses, the battle proved that the colonists could stand against professional soldiers. British casualties were enormous, over 1,000, compared to fewer than 500 colonial dead and wounded. The cost shocked Britain and encouraged American resistance. Throughout late 1775 and early 1776, the conflict spread beyond Massachusetts. In Canada, an American invasion sought to bring Quebec into the rebellion. The campaign, led by Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, ended in failure, but it showed the revolutionaries' ambition. In the South, clashes between patriots and loyalists erupted in the Carolinas. The war was no longer confined to New England. It was becoming a continental struggle. At the same time, ideas were shifting. Pamphlets and newspapers carried arguments for full independence. The most influential came in January 1776, when Thomas Paine published Common Sense. Written in plain language, it attacked monarchy as unnatural and urged the colonies to break free. It sold tens of thousands of copies in weeks, spreading radical ideas into taverns, homes, and churches. Paine's words gave voice to what many were beginning to feel, that reconciliation was no longer possible. By the spring of 1776, colonial leaders recognized that independence was inevitable. Congress urged colonies to form their own governments, free of royal authority. In June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was formed to draft a formal declaration. The task fell primarily to Thomas Jefferson, a young delegate from Virginia. Jefferson drew upon Enlightenment philosophy and colonial grievances to craft a document that was both an argument and a proclamation. Edited by Congress, his words became the Declaration of Independence. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration itself. The document announced to the world that the 13 colonies were now free states, united in their resolve to break away from Britain. It listed grievances against King George, condemned tyranny, and proclaimed the right of all people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The signing of the Declaration did not end the struggle. It intensified it. The colonies had crossed a point of no return. Britain would fight fiercely to hold its empire, and the Americans would now need to defend their fragile independence on the battlefield. As summer turned to autumn in 1776, the Revolution entered a new phase. Washington led his untested army into New York, where the British mounted a massive campaign. The Revolution, once a dispute over taxes, had now become a fight for national survival. The summer of 1776 marked a critical turning point in the Revolutionary War. Following the Declaration of Independence, George Washington faced the immense challenge of defending New York City from the largest professional army the colonies had ever confronted. British General William Howe arrived with 32,000 well-trained troops supported by warships and artillery. In contrast, Washington commanded fewer than 2,000 men, many inexperienced and poorly equipped, lacking uniforms, discipline, and supplies. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a devastating defeat for the Americans. The British flanked Washington's forces, forcing a chaotic retreat. Yet Washington demonstrated remarkable leadership and composure. Under the cover of night and fog, he orchestrated a complete evacuation across the East River to Manhattan. Every soldier, every horse, every piece of artillery was moved without alerting the British. It was a small miracle and a testament to Washington's ability to adapt under pressure. Following the retreat, the Continental Army continued a series of difficult maneuvers across New Jersey. Morale was low. Enlistments were expiring. Supplies were scarce, and the harsh winter was approaching. By December 1776, Washington commanded fewer than 3,000 troops. Many thought the revolution might collapse, yet Washington refused to give up. On Christmas night, 1776, he launched a daring surprise attack on Hessian forces stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Crossing the icy Delaware River in the dead of night, Washington's troops achieved a decisive victory. Nearly 900 Hessians were captured, with minimal American casualties. This small triumph reinvigorated the revolutionary cause. A week later, Washington won another engagement at Princeton, further boosting morale and demonstrating that the Continental Army could fight strategically despite limited resources. Throughout 1777, the war expanded in both geography and intensity. British strategy involved dividing the colonies, aiming to isolate New England from the South and Mid-Atlantic. General John Burgoyne advanced south from Canada, expecting to meet British forces from New York, but miscommunication and logistical challenges hindered coordination. Washington faced multiple defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, losing Philadelphia to the British. Yet the Army's resilience remained evident. Washington adapted tactics, emphasized discipline, and relied on intelligence networks to anticipate British moves. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge tested the Continental Army to its limits. Soldiers suffered from cold, starvation, disease, and desertion. Washington shared their hardships, inspecting encampments, distributing scarce supplies, and offering personal encouragement. Into this bleak winter came Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who trained troops in European drills, instilling discipline and cohesion. By spring 1778, the Continental Army emerged as a more professional and capable fighting force, ready to confront the British with improved strategy and organization. In the north, the victory at Saratoga in October 1777 became a turning point. General Burgoyne surrendered his army to American forces, demonstrating that the Continental Army could defeat British troops in significant engagements. This success convinced France to formally enter the war as an American ally, providing troops, naval support, and crucial supplies. Meanwhile, skirmishes and campaigns continued in the South. Loyalists and patriots clashed, with guerrilla tactics and small battles shaping local control. Both sides understood that winning hearts and loyalty among civilians was as important as battlefield victories. Part 3 concludes with the American forces emerging from their early trials, hardened and organized, yet still facing immense challenges. The Revolution was far from over, but the foundations of a disciplined Continental Army, international alliances, and strategic thinking were taking shape. By 1778, the American Revolution had become a full-scale continental conflict. French recognition of American independence had shifted the balance of power. French troops, ships, and supplies began arriving, providing much-needed support. The Continental Army, now more disciplined after Valley Forge and the training of Baron von Steuben, was able to coordinate with Allied forces for joint operations against the British. The war shifted focus to the southern colonies, where the British hoped to rally Loyalist support. Savannah, Georgia fell in December 1778, followed by the capture of Charleston, South Carolina in 1780. These early successes in the South demonstrated the continued threat posed by British professional armies, but also highlighted weaknesses in colonial coordination and supply lines. American forces, under leaders like Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan, responded with a combination of conventional and guerrilla warfare. Smaller, mobile units harassed British troops, disrupted supply chains, and wore down the enemy over time. The victories at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse in 1781, though often costly, demonstrated that strategy and local knowledge could offset British numerical superiority. Meanwhile, George Washington and the main Continental Army remained vigilant in the north, keeping pressure on British forces while coordinating with French allies. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, established control over Chesapeake Bay, preventing British resupply and allowing American and French forces to plan a decisive southern campaign. In the fall of 1781, Washington saw an opportunity to end the war. Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, had fortified Yorktown, Virginia. Coordinating with French troops under General Rochambeau and the French fleet, Washington executed a complex siege operation. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown, cutting off escape by land. De Grasse's fleet blocked the Chesapeake, preventing reinforcement or retreat by sea. For 3 weeks, artillery pounded the British fortifications. Trenches were dug closer to enemy lines each night. The siege tested the patience, endurance, and morale of all involved. Washington inspected the lines daily, ensuring coordination and efficiency. The British, trapped and unable to resupply, gradually weakened. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of approximately 7,000 men. It was a decisive moment, effectively ending major combat in the Revolutionary War. The victory at Yorktown demonstrated the power of international alliances, strategic coordination, and persistent American resistance. While the fighting largely ceased, diplomacy now took center stage. Negotiations between Britain, the United States, and France culminated in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The treaty recognized American independence, established borders, and secured fishing rights, among other provisions. The colonies, once a collection of disparate provinces under British rule, were now free and united as the United States of America. Part 4 concludes with the Revolution achieving its ultimate objective. Independence was secured, the British threat was neutralized, and the foundations for a new nation were laid. Yet, the challenges of governance, economic stability, and unity would soon follow, requiring the same perseverance and vision that had sustained the Revolution. The year 1781 marked the climax of the American Revolution. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and endurance, the colonies were on the brink of independence. The siege of Yorktown had decisively broken British military power in North America. General Cornwallis, surrounded by American and French forces on land and trapped by the French Navy at sea, surrendered on October 19th. The image of British officers laying down their arms, American and French troops standing vigil, and Washington calmly observing the formal surrender, became emblematic of the Revolution itself. It was a victory forged from resilience, strategy, and unwavering determination. Yet the war did not officially end on that day. Diplomatic negotiations between Britain, the United States, and France continued. For nearly 2 years, representatives such as John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to ensure that the sacrifices of the revolutionaries would translate into lasting freedom. Their efforts culminated in the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783. The treaty recognized American independence, defined territorial boundaries stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and secured important trade and fishing rights. The war that had begun with small skirmishes and protests in Boston and Lexington had now concluded with international recognition of a new nation. The American Revolution transformed lives on a profound scale. Ordinary soldiers who had endured frost, hunger, and battle returned home as citizens of a free country. Women who had supported the war effort through supply, communication, and resilience began to see new possibilities for influence in the emerging republic. Native Americans, unfortunately, found themselves caught between the competing ambitions of colonists and the Crown, often facing displacement and loss of land. Enslaved Africans seized the turmoil as a chance to escape, join militias, or negotiate freedom, laying early foundations for future struggles for liberty. George Washington, now a national hero, exemplified the principles of leadership and civic duty that would define the new nation. His choice to resign as commander-in-chief and return to Mount Vernon demonstrated that power in a republic must always remain accountable. The fledgling United States faced enormous challenges, crafting a functioning government, maintaining unity among 13 diverse states, managing a fragile economy, and defining its identity on the global stage. Yet the ideals of liberty, self-determination, and representative governance endured. The revolution had set a precedent. A people could rise against oppression, endure hardship, and establish a government of their own choosing. These ideals would inspire generations to come, not only in America, but across the world. From France to Latin America, the American Revolution became a symbol of possibility, a testament that principles and perseverance could reshape nations. As we reflect on these years, it is clear that the American Revolution was not simply a military conflict. It was a profound transformation of society, politics, and culture. It reshaped identities, challenged norms, and created a nation grounded in the belief that freedom was worth the cost of struggle. The Continental Army, the militias, the civilians, and the visionaries of the time together forged a republic that could stand as a beacon of hope and determination. And so the American Revolution concludes not with a single act, but with the enduring promise of freedom, responsibility, and the relentless pursuit of a better future for all who would call this new nation home.